for on-demand viewing. Also, there will be Q&A at the end of the session, so please post your questions by using the Ask button at the lower left side of your screen. We're thrilled to have three outstanding professionals with us today. We have Mike Carnathan, Manager of Research and Analytics for the Atlanta Regional Commission, Lilly Lynn, Specialist Leader with Deloitte Consulting, and John Schuler, Senior Director for Cox Communications. So let's get started. We'll hear from all three speakers, and then we'll move into some discussion, followed by Q&A. Mike, will you get us started?
Yes, thanks, Jason, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Carnathan, and I head up research and analytics with the Atlanta Regional Commission. As part of our portfolio, we run a data shop called Neighborhood Nexus. Now, I'm sure you're wondering what Atlanta Regional Commission, or ARC, is. We are a comprehensive regional planning agency. And really what's core at our mission is creating a vibrant, robust economy and economic opportunities for all residents. And yes, that's a very lofty goal, and there's a lot of things that have to be tended to make that happen. So, that's why we have a bunch of planning functions under one roof, transportation planning. We have natural resources to make sure that we have an abundance of water going into the future, community development to make sure that our places are places that people want to live in. We also plan for services for older adults. And then finally, yes, we have a workforce development planning function under our roof. In other words, we are the recipients of federal WIOA dollars. And that's why I'm here today, is I'm going to be giving you a very macro, high-level look at what the workforce is in Metro Atlanta, really with a focus on some of the challenges we have. And again, at that macro level, what are some of the challenges we have in the workforce ecosystem? And, and we partner with a lot of other regional organizations. And really, one of the key goals for kind of the regional workforce ecosystem is upward economic mobility. And, we have to look at that through a special equity lens. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Now, other speakers after me, Lilly and John, they'll be talking on a much more tactical level, giving you some great ideas for your organizations. But I'm going to keep it very high level, and we're just going to dive right into it right now. So if you'll advance the slide. So who is Metro Atlanta's workforce? If you look at the composition of the workforce, slightly overrepresented by white population compared to the composition of the population as a whole. Next slide. And if you look at it broken out by age, we have some pretty fascinating differences by age. If you look at the percent of current employment, percent of those currently employed, well, that tends to skew older. And if you look at the percent of new hires coming in, that tends to skew younger. I mean, you actually kind of want to see that churn in your workforce, but it just means that, the younger generations coming in, they're going to come in with different expectations from their employers. Next slide, please. And then, of course, the educational composition. This looks very similar to the educational composition of the region. In other words, about 39% of the workforce has at least a bachelor's degree. Next slide, please. Now, this is a complicated chart, and I love complicated charts. You'll see more complicated charts in this presentation. But here what we're looking at is we're really breaking down the workforce into distinct occupations. And then we're looking at it from a race and ethnicity standpoint. So you'll see this red line that goes right down the middle. That's sort of the dividing line between white workers and workers of color. And so any occupation where you see that blue line going to the left, well, that's overrepresentation of white workers. And then you see occupations like healthcare support, or occupations like building and grounds cleaning and maintenance. They have an overrepresentation of workers of color. Now, here's the thing about the workforce ecosystem in Metro Atlanta. Those occupations that have an overrepresentation of workers of color. Those are also the lowest paying occupations. So that's one of the pieces of the puzzle that we'll be talking about today. Next slide. Now, before we get into any of that stuff, we do have to acknowledge what COVID's impact is on our workforce and our economy as a whole. Next slide. Essentially, what we're talking about is about 4 years of job gains wiped out in just a few months. Now, the job gains have been pretty impressive month over month, but we're still have dug ourselves kind of a 4 year hole. So we do have a long ways to go to get back to pre-pandemic levels. Next slide. And then you'll see that this is a broad-based economic decline. Now, there are certain sectors that are taking it on the chin a little bit more, like leisure and hospitality. Those are those businesses that do, like, food services, restaurants, amusement parks, things like that. And so we do see that there are certain winners and losers that are coming out of this pandemic economy. Next slide. And so if you look carefully, these are some kind of these sub-industries. And here what we're looking at is we're looking at the decline in employment in these industries between February and April. And then we're looking at how they've bounced back, or whether they've bounced back, between April and September. So at the very first line, you'll see performing arts, spectator sports, etc. These are these businesses and occupations that really require, in person. And, we're not doing that in the pandemic. So obviously they've lost a lot of jobs between February and April, and they really haven't bounced back. Now, if you keep going down, you'll see places like food services and drinking places. Kind of the same deal. Between February and April, nobody was going to restaurants. And so you'll see a big contraction in jobs there. We've reopened. We're slowly getting back out into the economy, and you'll see that those food services and drinking places have recovered, but not all the way. That's what that black dot represents. So they're still in contraction territory, but they are bouncing back. And then one final note on this slide is if you look at the very bottom, you'll see some of these blue bars down here, places like warehousing and storage, couriers and messengers, super centers, warehouse clubs. Those are the areas, those are those things that we're buying a lot of stuff from them because we're staying at home more. And so they've actually seen a job gain compared to pre-pandemic levels. And so again, this is just giving you an idea of the sorting that's happening here between kind of the sectors that are really struggling and then the sectors that are actually going to come out of the pandemic probably in stronger position. Next slide, please. Now, I wanted to bring this up because just to give to really give props to the federal relief package that was that we had in the spring and summer. That really boosted up spending. And remember, consumer spending is about 70% of this economy. And so what we want to see is, we're very hopeful for a second relief package coming from the feds, because you can already see that consumer spending, especially by the unemployed, is already declining. Next slide, please. All right, so now we've talked about the COVID's impact, but it is not equitably distributed. So I'm going to go through these slides pretty quickly. Next slide. Black workers are twice as likely as white workers to have experienced unemployment. Women are more likely than men to have experienced unemployment or had to leave the workforce. And if you're a person with less than a high school diploma, well, this pandemic economy feels like the Great Depression to you. Next slide, please. Low-income workers are faring the worst in this economy. Job levels for those making less than $27,000, they have dropped to almost 19% from their pre-pandemic levels, while higher wage workers, those making $60,000 and more, well, they've actually increased their employment a little bit. And so that's, we have some sectors of the economy, some people in this economy that are doing fine, maybe even come out of this doing better, but we have some sectors and some people who were doing worse. Next slide, please. Now, this is another one of those complicated slides that I warned you about earlier, but essentially all we're doing is we're taking some of these subsectors and looking at the racial composition of them. The bars that are going up are those subsectors that have the highest overrepresentation of workers of color. And then the bars are colored in a way to where the orange bars represent low wage sectors, and then the green bars represent high wage sectors. What you see immediately is those subsectors with the highest overrepresentation of workers of color are, at least the top 5, are all low wage sectors. And that's sort of the crux at some of the issues that regional partners are thinking about when we think about the workforce ecosystem. Next slide, please. And I'm going to go and I'm going to finish up here pretty soon. It's really about wages. So the average wage in Metro Atlanta pays less than the average wage in other metropolitan areas. That wasn't always the case. You see, in the 90s, you could move to a Metro Atlanta and get a job that paid more than the average wage. Next slide, please. And so what this boils down to is wage stagnation. The workers in Metro Atlanta essentially haven't gotten a raise since 1999. Next slide, please. And again, a complicated chart, but this is really talking about the middle wage occupations. We've seen a stagnation in growth in those jobs. We've seen pretty good wage growth in the high wage jobs, really, really good wage growth in the low wage jobs. But in the middle, well, we're kind of stuck a little bit. And then if you add that, if you go to the next slide, add that middle wage job stagnation to, next slide, please. If you add that middle wage job stagnation to the fact that low wage jobs are paying less today on average than they did 5 years ago, well, we have a problem with upward economic mobility. Now, this chart, again, complicated, but what you're looking at is you're looking at Atlanta and you're comparing it to other metropolitan areas. The bars represent wage growth. Bars going down means that they pay less today than 5 years ago. The bars going up mean that they pay more. So you see a lot of bars going down here in Metro Atlanta, and then the bars that are going up, well, they're not going up as much as the bars in other metropolitan areas. So if you go to the next slide, and I'll finish on this slide, and this is a pretty sobering slide, because what you'll see is Atlanta ranks at the very bottom in terms of upward economic mobility. And what that means is, that rags to riches story, the ability of a child born into poverty to for him or her to raise out of poverty in their lifetime. Well, that story is hardest here in Metro Atlanta than almost any other place in the nation. And this is despite the fact that we're kind of ranking the top 5 in overall job growth in the last 20, 30 years. And so that's the challenge that we're looking at the Atlanta Regional Commission in our overall workforce, our regional workforce partners. And that's why it's very important to take that equity lens, because we came into this pandemic with challenges in equity. The pandemic itself is exacerbating those challenges. And so, that's why we're really focusing on that. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Lilly, and she's going to talk a lot more tactically about what Deloitte's looking at.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Perfect setup. So really appreciate that. And so what I'm here to talk to you about today, obviously I represent Deloitte, but Deloitte is not by any means the only way or the only firm that's doing work in this space for obvious reasons. And I think Mike's made a really compelling argument about how important it is for organizations to be paying attention to diversity and inclusion. And I'm sure it goes without saying to acknowledge the fact that this has been a very difficult year for everyone, both because of the pandemic, but also because of some of the social injustice that we've seen. And so organizations are paying a lot more attention to this particular topic and beginning to make more investments in this area. So you'll see on the next slide, I wanted to make sure that I provided a balanced perspective here. So as I mentioned, Deloitte's not the only firm doing work in this area. This is just a small additional sampling of other firms and organizations that are devoting a lot of time, attention, and thought to this issue of diversity and inclusion, and what we collectively as society can be doing to address the issue, in conjunction with some of the points that Mike was making about the labor issues that are facing cities like Atlanta. What more can organizations be doing in order to be really helping the rags to riches story become more of a reality than an exception? So you'll just see here, these are just a few samplings of articles, thought papers that other organizations have put out there. And then you'll see on the next slide, we at Deloitte have also put a lot of thought into how diversity and inclusion can be addressed from multiple angles. So you'll see here, we look at it from a leadership traits perspective. We also think about what needs to happen within the boardroom in order to make diversity and inclusion a better thing for organizations, or to help organizations really advance up the maturity curve. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. And also what all needs to be happening within the organization in order to support the movement of diversity and inclusion within organizations. So on the next slide, you'll see that there's many statistics that really support the importance of it. And I think you can read it yourselves and see some of the quotes here. But what's really astounding is in our research, we have found that 71% of organizations, while they aspire to have inclusive cultures, only about 12% actually feel like they've gotten there or have met that goal. And as you can imagine, we've received all kinds of phone calls and requests in order to help an organization address their D&I issues. And we are finding that many of them, again, I'll talk about the maturity curve, are falling on the lower ends of really being able to demonstrate the degree of diversity and inclusion that they would like. Also, another great statistic here, 78% of leaders believe that diversity and inclusion is a competitive advantage, yet only 38% of those leaders that we've surveyed actually admit that their CEO is actively involved in really supporting those initiatives. So just another reason or another bit of validation as to why it really begins at the top. And if organizations make these types of investments in D&I, then you'll see that they get some payoff there. You'll see that 15 times the number of organizations with high levels of racial diversity have revenue and sales 15 times higher than those that are lower on the curve. And then there's a 39% increase in customer satisfaction for organizations who make this type of investment. You've all seen also through the Black Lives Matter movement, there is a lot of interest amongst the millennials and the younger generations that are now going to become your future workforce. And so the more organizations can really appeal to the minds and the mindsets of those that are ultimately going to be applying for jobs and entering into your workforce, the more likely you'll be able to attract the best talent. So on the next slide, I wanted to just go and dive a little bit deeper into how organizations or firms like Deloitte are really approaching this. What I'm sharing with you here is our Deloitte approach, but I'm sure other firms that I had shared with you earlier have similar frameworks and are really thinking about diversity and inclusion in the same way. So what you see here are what we consider to be a framework that really lists out or address the different activators that are going to be required for organizations in order to really support movement around diversity and inclusion. So it all begins first with an infrastructure. To what degree does your organization really lay the groundwork in order to create more of a culture? And I'll talk about culture in just a second, to support diversity and inclusion, to have the mindset that's really going to sustain efforts made in that direction. Then we talk about culture. So has there been a culture or a spirit of diversity and inclusion that has been adopted by the organization? And is that going to further help really promote and sustain inclusive behaviors amongst your organization or company? Then we talk about talent, and I'll do a little bit of a drill down of that in just a second, but it's really important to be thinking about whether or not your talent practices are leading to more inclusive decisions and promoting greater diversity, especially amongst the top ranks of the organization, which is where we tend to see more disparity amongst those that are underrepresented and those who have historically been the majority. Going over to the right-hand side, this is when we take an outside-in perspective. So we think about what the organizations are doing in order to also, in addition to addressing their internal diversity, what are they doing to think about diversity of customer and whether or not they are really thinking about the different walks of life that they want to appeal to that will ultimately obviously help their bottom line, but will also help them really establish more of a brand of being an inclusive organization. Speaking of brand, the more an organization can do to really put out there the efforts that they are making in order to be more inclusive and more diverse and to contribute to greater equality in the society is obviously going to feed back into their customer base as well as help them recruit better talent, because those applicants who are of a diverse background will be more interested in working for an organization that they know have thought about these things. And then finally, what is the organization doing to contribute and give back to the community in order to address some of those socioeconomical issues that are getting in the way of allowing underrepresented populations be able to move opportunities higher up in the organization or into those jobs that Mike just talked about that tend to be underrepresented, or tend to be less represented by diverse populations. And then finally, the real groundwork that you need in order to really promote diversity and inclusion is around leadership and making sure that you've got the right leaders in the organization to support these types of behaviors. And then analytics. So how are you going to measure the degree to which your organization is really advancing the needle there? And how are you going to hold those that are involved accountable for doing their part in order to promote greater diversity and inclusion? So in the next slide, this is just a little bit more of a drill down of the talent factors. So you can see here, and I believe we've got a large HR audience here that are listening to this presentation. These are different talent management or HR applications that are impacted or can impact diversity and inclusion. So from thinking about who your successors are going to be for the top parts of the organization, your C-suite leaders, to performance management. What are you doing to make sure that your performance management practice is safe and unbiased and that your leaders are evaluating people in the most unbiased and inclusive way? To rewards and compensation, how do you make sure that you're closing the pay gap amongst men and women? Or how are you making sure that minorities or underrepresented populations are getting paid in the same way that their majority counterparts are? So just a little bit for you to chew on as you think about how this has application to HR, in case you haven't already seen the connection there. So now I'm just going to spend a few more minutes talking about how we go about really tackling diversity and inclusion and helping an organization move the needle. So it all begins with on the next slide, a series of actions or ways in which we can support organizations that have decided to make an investment in this particular area. The first begins with a current state assessment, where we look at the different practices that are being used by the organization, mostly from an HR perspective, but we can look outside of that as well. And also looking at their workforce statistics and their data. So I know the whole part of this piece of the conference is about analytics. This is where the analytics can come into play to really tell us a little bit more about where an organization stands when it comes to incredibly mature from a diverse and inclusive perspective, or needing a little bit of work and really needing to start to bridge a few gaps in terms of the way in which they are going about moving talent throughout the organization. Based off of that current state analysis, we then work with organizations to come up with a strategy and a roadmap to help them begin to identify a action-based approach to closing any gaps that we identified from that current state analysis, and making sure that they're not eating the elephant in one bite, but rather that they are really being thoughtful about how they're going to really tackle these problems. If we have determined, in many cases we do, that there's a foundational learning opportunity here where their leaders and their associates in the organization just need to learn a little bit more about inclusivity and implicit bias, we can put programs into place there that are more broad brush, or we can create customized learning programs in order to, let's say, help a leader who's about to move into a very transformational role that is going to involve an underrepresented population or a diverse workforce, and helping them really think through how they can promote and model the behaviors that are really going to help the workforce move more toward a diverse and inclusive environment. And then finally, at the end, we always need to measure our success. And so that's really where we come in at the end and help the organization reevaluate how far they've come, and then go back and do another analysis and help them re-strategize or course correct in order to continue to move that needle forward. On the last slide that I'm going to share here is just, as I've been talking about the maturity model, this is just, again, one example of a maturity curve that we've developed at Deloitte. But, you know, many organizations, as they're entering into a consulting agreement with us, have no idea where they are on this curve. Some of them are a little maybe in the dark and think that they're more along the collaborating side of things. But in our research and in our experience working with organizations in this area, we are finding that 80% of organizations fall within the emerging pillar there, or maybe even just the compliance pillar. So my hope is that in the future, we start to see more and more organizations move further up the curve. But right now, there is a little bit of work ahead of us, but it's really great that we're seeing a lot of momentum right now, and we'll continue to do so in the next few years. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my colleague, John. John?
Lily, thank you. Thank you so much for that information. And for this part of the presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about data analytics and what does data analytics mean. So the first slide we'll start with is who are we? And if you'll advance the slide, please. Perfect. Thank you. Who are we? So first of all, in terms of data analysts, and sometimes you'll hear the word data engineer and data scientist, all part of the same ecosystem. I've been practicing this type of profession at Cox for the past 8 years. And the one thing that we've seen, especially in the past 5 years, is there's been a huge increase, not only in the interest of analytics from an HR perspective and data science, but then also the advancement of technology and in the interest in organizations to start using this information. So when you think about a data analyst, you know, the first thing I always like to say is we're more than just numbers, right? We're not number crunchers or data crunchers. One of the evolving factors here is that we're really more of a partner and a solutionist. And what that really means is that we can come into a situation and not only look at the information and the data, but then also assist in promoting specific ideas, understanding things in terms of what Mike shared, a little bit of the socio-demographic aspects of it, and then also what Lilly has shared too in terms of diversity and inclusion. Some key evolving things of when you think data analyst or a scientist is really that we're learners, we're storytellers, we're collaborators. But in addition to that, I really think that in our roles now that we are change agents. And what I mean by that is with access to this abundance and this wealth of information that it's rich, it's contextually interesting, it's timely, it can help with diversity and inclusion efforts, hiring efforts, or even something from the HR operational aspect, like an open enrollment type effort, that we're really change agents in bringing forward information that helps the organization now evolve and do things differently. And that's really a jump in this field from being a data modeler or a data miner. Still very important concepts, very important things to have and to be able to do the technical aspect. But in terms of being a solutionist, we're really evolving into this role of complementing the technical skills with more of the softer skills as a partner, a consultant, or someone that can actually come in and help not just with the numbers, but also with the solution. Next slide, please. So when we think about what we do and how we do things is really the mission and purpose of what we're doing is providing that meaningful and actionable insight. One of the key things that has changed over time in today's world with so much information, and again, especially with diversity and inclusion information and other topics, is what we're trying to be now is more narrow and specific. It's one thing to provide information as far as a macro trend or general concepts and ideas, but part of the difference that has happened over the past several years is that contextually you want more narrow and specific information that will drive a business result. And in addition with that, something that I think too is being a solutionist or a partner or a consultant within the business is really we do that within the cultural context of human resources in a very ethical manner. Working in the HR domain with information and having access to proprietary and very sensitive data, something that we're always doing is asking ourselves, is this PII information, is this protected? Who should get this information? And having all that proper control data governance that HR is known for in order to make sure the information, privacy, and other aspects associated with that are fully protected. Some of the other things that we do now are we're really spending more time on visualization. And visualization or creating a picture or some visualization model really is a way to convince people in a very meaningful way that something has changed or something is different. What's significantly different compared to the way things were done, more in a what you would call a tabular format, is with the new tools and capabilities that have come forward over the past 5 years, is that you really can tell a great story with data and use it in a visualized manner. And one of the greatest challenges in this domain or this field is telling a great story with visualizing it, but not using numbers. It's a very hard thing to do, but if you do it in a way that's compelling and it helps facilitate a discussion, an outcome, or generates ideas, that's really the intent of that from that perspective. Next slide, please. So storytelling. So another huge evolution, and this is very true within the HR space with analytics, is really moving from complex explanations to doing storytelling. And what that essentially means is that we want to take the complexity and not explain a technique or a method or methodology or a process or how did I get the data, but really go into create the meaningful and the reliable chunks of information such as Mike demonstrated earlier, that's compelling. You can see what's happening. It's part of the storytelling that you want to do. So a data analyst or scientist now is not necessarily in the domain of just presenting the numbers. They really have to tell this. They really have to tell a story that goes with it. A great example that our talent team had shared with me recently, and they said this is some of the ways that they had changed their storytelling. Is they said, hey, cycle time reduced for the quarter by 5 days for hiring. And great accomplishment, wonderful, but really what's the story in that? And what they had explained, when they went and told the story and explained in more detail, was that the cycle time had reduced by 5 days across 100 positions and enabled 500 more days of selling in our critical markets that comprise the majority of our revenue. That is the same statement, it's the same outcome, but also it links back to what's the business purpose and how is it meaningful to the partnering organization, but also it's the story and it's linking that narrative and cause and effect back to what HR has been doing to improve the organization. And then also at the same time, really demonstrating that HR is a full partner and analytics can contribute to that too. Next slide, please. So the past 3 years have been a lot of changes in analytics, especially around the HR space. Again, to summarize, it's really not about the data. It's really about change and acceptance. And in that, as far as being a solutionist, someone said, well, what do you do all day? You look at information, and it's like, no, I help people understand data and information, and then also sometimes help them accept it. Because sometimes the data tells a much different story than what someone has expected in the past or what they've experienced personally. So there is this there's this tension sometimes where you have to help people understand and then work through change and acceptance. Also, data does reflect the business processes. So as part of an analyst now, we have to understand how is the data created? What's the systems and what happens in terms of the data creation? Storytelling and visualization is absolutely essential. And over time, maturity of using the data will improve, but also the recognition that this is an evolution. Not everyone's at the same place. And really some other pieces of using information is in this new HR analytical world is you have to be patient. Accepting takes time, and revealing new data sources and new conclusions takes discussion. Additionally, we're not so much concerned about precision versus accuracy. And what that specifically means is that we're really focused on, is it north, south, east, and west? For much of the data, we do not need the precision of northeast by 32 degrees. So that's another big piece and an evolution that highly precise data is very expensive to get, but accurate data within our domain, we can still make some great business decisions and remove uncertainty so everyone can move forward. And then also asking the why. And to conclude this segment is really asking the why and bring some solutions and not just the data. So from the intake of a project and maybe in the D&I world, asking what's the why? Why do we want to do this? What's the objective? What would you like to see a success? And then helping the organization all the way through that steps of that process, not just with the data, but with the solution becomes very important. So that concludes my part of the presentation. Mike and Lily, we're all going to get back together and do some Q&A. And I encourage everyone to please ask some questions through your app. Mike, there's a question that's been asked. What do you think the Atlanta labor market will look like in 5 years? Can you give us some insight to that?
Yeah, I can, John, and I could honestly take an hour to answer that question. I mean, that's a big question, but I mean, I think it boils down to demographics and what we're seeing in Metro Atlanta and really as the nation as a whole is, we are becoming more diverse. And I mean, it's demographics is like a destiny trend. And so we are becoming more diverse, and our diversity is really concentrated in those younger age cohorts. So as younger workers continue to matriculate through the workplace, it's not, diversity and inclusion isn't just going to be an imperative, it's just going to be a new way of life. But we have challenges at the same point, because today, as I was trying to show you, is a lot of the diverse workforce are in that lower income occupations, and we need to figure out ways to upskill them and to get them prepared for the jobs of the future, because that is the future, is greater diversity.
All right, thank you, Michael. Lily, we actually have a question for you too. Looking 5 years into the future, what changes do you anticipate or see with diversity and inclusion in the workspace?
That's a good question. I was alluding to it toward the end of my presentation. My hope is that we'll start to see more organizations move up the curve in terms of their maturity and the degree to which they're making investments in diversity and inclusion. I think also with the younger workforce continuing to really come into the organizations, you'll start to see more of the cultural elements of diversity and inclusion becoming ingrained within the heart and soul of different companies. And so we start to see less and less of the pushback on training and pushing forward of initiatives and importance for demonstrating inclusivity. But it's a pipe dream of mine, but I do think that things are going in that direction, especially based off of how we have seen an uptick in the request for consulting services around this topic just in the past 6 months.
All right, thank you, Lily. Okay, so there's a question for me. What do you find to be the biggest hurdle in converting conventional data into a story? That's a great question. I think many times it's the creativity that goes into telling the story. And one of the things that we've tried to look for at taking conventional data is really try to find a great analogy or something that people can really grasp onto and relate to that might be a common experience, something that maybe relates to the information, but the individual will have experience with. So with that, what we've done in terms of storytelling and trying to enhance that skill is we'll work on what's the analogy, what's the reference points, is this a common experience that we can convey? In addition, using more visualization too. And with that, being very selective about the colors, making sure that scales and measures in the presentation are very clear and understandable. Also making sure that someone couldn't take the presentation, kind of flip it upside down and come to a different conclusion too. So in another key technique that we've done is before we present the story, we'll actually pitch the story. And we'll have a few pitch sessions to where individuals will share the story with them and say, does this make sense? Does this resonate with you? What would you suggest? So with that, I hope that helps. And we don't have a lot of time, but there's a whole art and science now behind storytelling. And there's a lot of great opportunity to learn online and also formally through a lot of organizations.
Yeah, there is a whole discipline of data visualization, and I think John got it exactly right. But I want to highlight something that John said in his presentation that I'm going to start stealing when I give my presentations, and it's the accuracy versus precision point. I think a lot of folks, when they're trying to create these data visualizations that really just turn into storytelling, don't confuse accuracy for precision, because if you're trying to be precise and if you're trying to show how precise your data is, that visualization probably isn't going to work very well. Settle for accuracy instead. Settle on getting people closer to the story rather than closer to the data. And those are two different things. So, but yeah.
No, absolutely, Mike. And to kind of finish the thought, data can be like a Monet painting, right? The farther you go out, the more your eye is going to mix the colors. And really, it depends on the perspective and the depth that you want. And that will really help as a great analogy to really help form the picture that you want the individual to see.
Right. I'm going to steal that one too, John.
You're welcome. I'm happy to have you them, because I have borrowed them from someone else too. Lily, a question for you. You mentioned that there had been an increased interest in the D&I efforts overall, but also within your firm. Can you give some sense of the scale of that increase of interest?
Well, we're sold out. So we now have like a little bit of a waiting period before we can actually even begin to engage with organizations to start to talk about it. I would say, if I were to kind of, take a stab in the dark, that we probably have about 40 active projects going on right now with multiple organizations. And there was a little bit of a pause put on opportunities around implicit bias training, because there was an executive order that was put forth by the Trump administration. So there was a little bit of a slowdown with that regard, but in terms of conducting current state analyses and things like that, organizations are still very interested in showing that they're doing something, especially because they understand that that's impacting their customer base and their ability to recruit talent. And also because they have a heartfelt desire to be really investigating that and trying to change things. I think come January, we might start to see more of an uptick in the implicit bias training again. That's just a forecast there, but I don't think this is going away. I think for at least the next 2-3 years, we're going to see a lot of companies doing more and more to gain more momentum around ensuring that there's good representation amongst their organization and continuing to respond to the Black Lives Matter movement.
Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. We're going to give everyone back a few minutes. Thank you for attending our sessions. Thank you for Michael and Lily and myself. Thank you all for spending some time with us. And we wish you absolutely the best of luck in the new year, and look forward to seeing you at more of these forums in the future. Have a great day, everyone. Appreciate all of you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Great afternoon, guys.
To put the ultimate in high-fidelity music listening within the reach of everyone. The tape is now completely rewound, ready for play.
All in thrilling new